Alright, welcome to the very first episode of Whiteboard Wednesdays. This is going to be a weekly video series that I do and post up on YouTube and the Comprehensive Strength website as well as our Facebook page. And in this video series I'm going to cover some more specific topics within the world of strength and conditioning because the articles that I've written so far have been fairly general. And so hopefully we can get some requests as to topics that I can cover so that people are getting information that they really want. And this first topic that I'm going to be dealing with in this episode and the next episode and possibly even a third is a requested topic on strength training for runners and for more specifically distance running. And in this first episode I'm going to cover some of the considerations, some of the things that we want to think about when mixing strength training with running, as well as some of the challenges that running poses in terms of incorporating those two things in the same program. And then I also want to talk briefly about some of the areas of emphasis in terms of working on weaknesses that runners quite often have. So the first thing I'm going to get into here are some of those considerations, and I'm going to divide this into two categories just for simplicity's sake. I'm going to talk about beginners, so people who have just started training and have probably just started running, and they're not particularly experienced, they're not particularly adapted to running, they're not particularly efficient at it necessarily. And so quite often those people are going to be going for the shorter distances, 5K, 10K, maybe a half marathon, and quite often they're not looking for a specific time, they're often just looking to complete that distance. And so they might be jogging a little bit, they might be walking most of it, if not all of it. And so that's a very different situation than more advanced runners who are actually looking to be competitive and who are looking to make specific times, whether it's just wanting a personal best or if they need a specific qualifying time in order to get into a certain competition or a certain level of competition. And so I'm just going to split that into two categories. I've got beginners here, advanced here. And so some of the issues that these two groups are going to have that need to be addressed are going to be the same, and some of them are going to be different. And obviously, we also have to think about goals. Like I said, these people are shooting for specific times that they either really want or that they have to have. These individuals aren't going to care so much about that stuff. So, and obviously, I want to make the disclaimer that none of the stuff that I'm going to be saying is a prescription. None of it is necessarily intended for you. It's intended to be just general information because any program should be designed specifically for a particular individual. And if we get away from that, that causes a lot of problems. So what I'm dealing here, I'm not saying you should do this, you shouldn't do this, or anything like that. It's all just, here are some of the problems that we typically see with these populations. So it's not an exact science. These are just things that we typically see. So first, starting off, we're going to start off with some of the stuff that's actually common between these two groups. We're going to start off with a lack of thoracic extension. Thoracic extension. So that's the upper back. A lot of times, if we're talking about this group, the advanced group, a lot of times with runners we often see a forward shoulder position because they're spending a lot of time in that position running, and so they have excessive flexion, excessive rounding of the thoracic spine. Typically, very shoulders forward, position often internally rotated. And in terms of, since these people are concerned with performance, in terms of how that affects performance, we have to think about the fact that power in running isn't generated solely from the legs. With distance running, there's also a rotational component as well. And the more that upper back rounds, the more the shoulders come forward, the more that rotational capacity is limited. And so you can't generate as much power. And a lot of distance runners will actually break down at the upper body first before the legs. And a lot of times you see people running kind of like this, head down, back rounded. And so they're limiting that rotational power, but also the rib cage comes down. It makes it harder to get nice full breaths and get enough oxygen to the working muscles. So by working on thoracic extension, both through improving scapular strength, but also through loosening up some of the front of the shoulder that's probably tight from being in this position so much, that can really help the postural endurance of the upper back, can really help that rotational power, and it can help prolong power over whatever distance these individuals may be running. Now, if we're talking about beginners, that is also a problem, okay? But it's for different reasons. It's not because they're running a lot. It's because they're sedentary. They're sitting down a lot, often, at a desk, at a computer. So they're in this, round back, shoulders forward position. And younger and younger people are starting to get this from, computers, video games, cell phones. And so it's a serious problem that really needs to be addressed, but in terms of back health, in terms of posture and actually looking, confident and just being healthy and looking good. So, which is often what this group is concerned with. That's often a big goal. And so, even though the cause is different, it's the same issue and it's going to be addressed in the same ways. Now, moving on to the posterior chain. And so the posterior chain, when we talk about the posterior chain, we're talking about the back, glutes, and hamstrings. And with runners and with really a lot of endurance athletes in general, the posterior chain is very weak because it's not something that's getting used a whole lot. Unfortunately, that can cause problems because of the muscular imbalances between, say the quads and the hamstrings. That can cause knee issues. Weakness of the glutes can cause the knees to track in ways that they shouldn't necessarily be moving while running. And that can cause overuse, can cause tendonitis. And so we obviously want to avoid that as much as possible because we want to keep these people running because they need to. It's their sport. And so, and also with working on the back as well as the abdomen, the core in general, that's going to help postural endurance. You're going to help maintain good posture throughout the duration of a run, however long that distance may be. And so that's something that really needs to be addressed. For beginners, a weak posterior chain is definitely going to be an issue. Now, since these people probably haven't been training a whole lot, they probably don't have a whole lot of muscular imbalances. They're probably, they're typically weak pretty much everywhere. That said, a lot of times with beginners, it's not just a weak posterior chain. It's actually problems bending in general. Bending problems. So a lot of beginners will actually have a very difficult time bending at the hip. It's just not a movement pattern that they've learned. A lot of people will actually round the back to stoop down as opposed to bending at the hip. A lot of people bend at the knees. And so that's something that needs to be addressed, that movement pattern. And we sometimes do see that in very good runners as well. So it just depends. Again, it's a very individual thing. Now, another thing that we often see in both of these groups is tight hips. So tight hips are very common in runners, although some of them do some mobility work to try to deal with that problem, but not all of them. For beginners, tight hips aren't caused by lots of running and lots of use of the musculature in those areas. It's caused by being sedentary. It's caused by sitting down, and if you sit down a lot, those hip flexors are going to shorten. And so that can cause a lot of low back problems in the general population. Tight hips are a huge cause of low back problems. And so we want to deal with those, with that issue through some specific mobility work, get those hips loosened up in order to help avoid back problems. And also bending plays into that too. Getting people learning how to bend properly is going to help prevent back problems. Now, something that's going to be specific for these advanced individuals, because I talked about potential muscular imbalances. Sometimes we see a weakness of the vastus lateralis, so the outer portion of the quad, and that can be a problem because then the knee a lot of times starts caving in during runs. It puts some valgus force on the inside of the knee there, and that can cause some overuse injuries. And so we want to a lot of times work on strengthening the vastus lateralis, the outer part of the quad, as well as the glutes. And that's really going to help in terms of knee movement and preventing knee problems. So I'm going to vastus. Now, in beginners, one of the things that we want to think about is also, are they overweight? A lot of people just starting training will be carrying more fat than is healthy, and so that's something that's important to consider, especially if they do want to run, because that's extra weight, that's extra wear and tear on their joints if they are running. A little question mark there because it's not a given. Now, the final thing that I want to mention is that it's just overuse in general. I've mentioned it a couple of times, but I want to deal with that a little bit more specifically because overuse in these two groups is going to be common, but for different reasons. For the advanced group, overuse is going to be caused by a huge volume of running. In beginners, overuse is going to be caused by things like being overweight or by working into running too quickly and not taking the time to actually build up to a certain distance. And oftentimes by not doing any sort of strength work and strengthening connective tissue around the joints and things like that. So those are some considerations that we need to have when thinking about program design for a running population. Now, one of the challenges that we see, and the reason I put the overuse last is because this fits into the biggest challenge of running, which is that it's impact-based, right? So that does a couple things. One, that's putting more strain on the joints because that impact. But also, because it's impact-based, it's causing more eccentric loading. And so eccentric loading is when a muscle is lengthened under tension. Concentric is when it's shortened under tension. And so it varies slightly depending on how people run, but typically, yeah, there's going to be eccentric loading of the calves. There's going to be eccentric loading of the quads and the glutes. Now, granted, it's going to be through a small range of motion, but if you do that thousands and thousands of times over the course of a run, and that's going to make a difference because eccentric loading is going to cause more muscular damage, than concentric loading. And so it's going to have a greater impact, no pun intended, on any strength work that is going to be done in the program. And so for this group, we have to think about how do we minimize the loading on their joints because they're already doing a whole lot of stuff. In this group, it's going to be more about how can we prepare them for these impact forces once they start running. Okay? And so, yeah, it's going to differ, and this is going to be in the next video, but I'm going to deal with, I'm going to go over how to fit running and lifting into the same program. But that's too long to fit into this video today. But this is a huge challenge because if you run one day and lift the next, that's going to seriously affect the performance in that lifting session. And for this group, lifting is going to be the most important thing. Not everyone may like to hear that, but it's true. Because in terms of their goals, typically, their only goal isn't running. A lot of times they're looking to be healthier, to be more physically able just in general. They're often looking to lose weight. And so the strength work is going to have the biggest effect on those factors. And so it's going to get them to their goals more efficiently than just running itself. For the advanced group, they're going to be strength training in order to get as much possible performance out in their sport. So that's going to change a little bit. And also we have to consider that these individuals are going to be highly adapted to this stress. They're going to be much more efficient runners. So in general, it's going to be a lower stress. So if an advanced individual is going to run and then lift the next day, it's not going to have as great of an impact. It also doesn't matter as much because, again, running is going to be the primary focus. But for these individuals, the lifting is going to be more of a focus. And the running, if they're even doing any, if they're just looking to complete a 5K or a 10K or even a half marathon, do they need to run? They really don't. I mean, if they're just going to be walking most of it anyway, they should be doing a lot of walking. So that's just something to think about. Now, in terms of areas of emphasis, so taking all this stuff and thinking about how does this translate into actually an actual strength program. We want to think about different movement patterns. We want to think about different areas that need to be worked on. So we already discussed that sort of stuff. So first, if we're thinking about thoracic extension, if we're thinking about the upper back, scapular strength is going to be primary. So scapular strength work. So pal raises, I'll probably get into some of this stuff more specifically in a subsequent episode, but pal raises, trap 3 raises, things like that to work on scapular strength. And holds are also going to work on that too, as well as core work. I'll get into that in a second. We want to think about bending, lots and lots of bending, because that's going to work on the posterior chain. It's going to work on the back, glutes, and hamstrings. That is very, very important. That's going to play a vital role in any running program, any strength program for running. We also want to think about single leg work. It should be fairly self-explanatory why single leg work can benefit runners, because they're going to have one foot on the ground at a time, at least if they're actually running. There are some people who run, but it's more like power walking. And also single leg work, depending on what it is, if it's low box step downs, that can be good for building the vastus lateralis there, as well as the glutes. So again, addressing some of those specific issues. We want to think about core work. Holds primarily, front leaning rest on rings, things of that nature. It's going to work on isometric core strength and muscular endurance. And also, with those things, it's going to get into scapular strength as well. We also potentially want to think about rotational core work, but with the caveat that before doing any sort of rotational core work, you have to assess whether or not a person actually has decent rotational capacity. You don't want to assign rotational core work if someone has really poor capacity, because that's going to open someone up for injury. So if someone has good rotational capacity, and if I would say the isometric stuff, the holds should come first. If they've already developed that a little bit, then you can work in some rotational core work as well. Now, really, those are the main areas. So the last thing is really mobility. And so, again, I addressed some of this previously, but focusing specifically on the front of the shoulder and being able to open that up to get the shoulders back and into a better position. Focusing on the hips, especially the hip flexors. Also working on the quads, potentially the hamstrings, if they're being used a lot in the strength work. And then also the calves. And also being able to do some maintenance work on the knees and the ankles is going to go a long way in preventing overuse injuries. So those are the areas that we want to think about. And then in the next episode, I'll be getting into some of the general program guidelines and potentially some examples of how to lay things out throughout the week. And yeah, so that's it for today. And feel free to leave comments, ask questions, give us topics to cover in future episodes. And yeah, like, share, if you found this information at all useful. Hopefully you did. And yeah, we hope to see you next time.